He never wrote a gospel. He never stood before emperors or founded a theological school. Yet in the cracks where controversy, greed, and confusion threatened to break the fragile early churches, a certain sent one quietly held things together. Titus, the forgotten apostle here in the older sense of a sent one, a trusted delegate of Paul, offers a model of faithfulness that asks a simple question of you. What would happen to your church, your family, your workplace, your neighborhood if someone like Titus showed up and refused to let it fall apart? Titus emerges in the New Testament almost like a silhouette at the edge of a painting. He is named, entrusted, and then, remarkably, left with responsibility. The sparse mentions create a larger portrait by implication, a Gentile convert who became proof that the gospel breaks down ethnic walls, a reliable companion who could be trusted with both fragile doctrine and fragile finances, and a pastoral leader charged with bringing order out of social chaos. This is not the celebrity Christianity most of us imagine. It is steady, ordinary, sacrificial work done without applause. As we trace his life through Scripture, Acts 15, Galatians 2, the Epistle to Titus, 2 Corinthians 8, 2 Timothy 4:10, and through the cautious testimony of later tradition, we discover a path of discipleship shaped less by fame than by faithfulness. If you will stay with this story, you may find your own journey of faith reframed by Titus's quiet example. Titus's origins matter to the story because they make him an argument. He is introduced as a Gentile, a man shaped by Hellenistic culture, likely fluent in the social customs and philosophical habits of the Greco-Roman world. That background placed him outside the covenantal identity of Israel. He was uncircumcised. In the ancient Mediterranean world, bloodlines, ritual marks, and ancestral identity were not merely cultural trivia. They determined access, belonging, and honor. Into that landscape, Paul brings the gospel, which declares that faith, not lineage, forms the family of God. Titus's life becomes a living test case for that claim. When Paul brings him into mission work and refuses to subject him to Jewish ceremonial law, he is making a theological point through pastoral practice. Conversion, in Titus's case, is less a dramatic single moment recorded in a chapter, and more a pattern. A life increasingly reformed and redirected by Christ through Paul's teaching and example. Paul's influence is unmistakable. Titus travels with him, carries his letters, and acts as his representative. But it is crucial to see Titus not merely as a shadow of Paul. He is a man formed under Paul's mentorship who learns to lead, to mediate, and to embody a gospel that unites diverse peoples. That transformation, from Gentile outsider to trusted church leader, teaches a basic Christian truth. Grace does not merely pardon, it reconfigures identity and vocation. The moment that most clearly exposes the theological stakes of Titus's identity is the Jerusalem meeting described in Acts 15 and reflected in Galatians 2. The early church faced a crisis. Must Gentile converts submit to Jewish ceremonial law, including circumcision, to be full members of God's people? This was not a mere policy dispute. It cut to the heart of soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, and to ecclesiology, what it means to be the church. Circumcision controversy might sound technical, but its implications were existential for first-century believers. If salvation depended on adherence to ethnic rites, then the cross was not enough to unify Jews and Gentiles. If, however, salvation came by grace through faith, then the gospel truly transcended bloodlines. Titus's uncircumcised presence at these gatherings functioned as an embodied argument. When Paul refuses to force him into circumcision, insisting that gospel fellowship must not be conditioned upon cultural or ritual conformity, he is rehearsing a theology of grace that frees the church to be genuinely universal. The decision reached in Jerusalem, and the Apostle Paul's stance attested in Galatians 2, underscore that the church's unity depends on the gospel's ability to reconcile diverse identities under Christ, not to erase them under a single cultural uniformity. Titus, therefore, stands at the confluence of doctrine and practice. His very life supports the theological claim that grace trumps law as the basis for belonging. After that defining moment, Titus's role shifts from representation to pastoral responsibility. He became a missionary companion and a steady envoy, someone Paul could leave in delicate situations without second-guessing. The New Testament hints at the kinds of places Titus served and the tasks he undertook. Judeo-Hellenistic contexts where tensions between old loyalties and new commitments brewed, churches where false teachers stirred division, and congregations struggling with moral and organizational disorder. In these contexts, Titus's temperament matters as much as his theology. Paul entrusts him with pastoral diplomacy, to smooth rifts, to carry financial aid with transparency, to model moral integrity, and to appoint leadership that would endure. Consider the episode of the collection for Jerusalem, which appears most fully in 2 Corinthians 8. The churches in Macedonia and Achaia gather an offering to support the impoverished saints in Jerusalem, a profoundly costly and countercultural act of unity. Paul appoints trusted brothers to manage and deliver these funds, and the testimony of the manager's character is part of the appeal. Their integrity must persuade skeptics. Their reliability must silence rumor. Their humility must demonstrate that the offering is not a bid for power, but a sign of shared life. Titus's role in this effort highlights a dimension of leadership often overlooked: stewardship. Leadership here is as much about faithful handling of material resources as it is about teaching doctrine. Managing money in the early church was not merely an administrative task, it bore theological weight. The way offerings were collected and distributed either confirmed the gospel's credibility or undermined it. Titus's integrity in this service served as a visible proof that the gospel reshapes not only belief, but practice. Paul's strategy reveals something else about pastoral leadership. Trust is earned by consistency. When a church faces scandal, its recovery rarely begins with a sermon. It starts with the steady presence of people who model the virtues needed for communal healing: honesty, humility, courage, and patience. Titus embodied these virtues. He was a calm hand in turbulent spaces, a face people could trust to act without seeking credit. Modern leaders often thirst for recognition. Titus shows another way. He models a leadership that considers the survival and flourishing of the church more important than its own reputation. Crete is where Paul finally commits Titus to a long-term pastoral project, and here the stakes shift from short-term mediation to structural formation. Paul's letter to Titus paints Crete as a culture in need of urgent moral and spiritual repair. Paul uses blunt language to describe the problem: behaviors and sayings that distort the gospel and discredit the Christian witness. Into this environment, Titus is charged with 3 interlocking tasks: appoint elders with the right character and qualifications, silence false teachers by confronting doctrinal and moral error, and promote the kind of teaching that forms communities of sound faith across age and social boundaries. The epistle to Titus reads like a pastoral manual precisely because Paul understood that doctrine must translate into daily conduct. The theological core is expansive and practical. The grace of God appears to all people. It teaches us to deny ungodliness and worldly passions, and it trains us to live upright, godly lives. Titus 2:11-14. This formulation is the heartbeat of Paul's pastoral theology. Grace not as license, but as formation. Grace forgives. It also forms. It is a training ground for righteousness. That linkage between belief and behavior is central to Titus's assignment. Paul's insistence on leaders' character, family order, and sound doctrine shows a conviction that institutions survive or collapse on the quality of the people who steward them. Look closely at how Paul describes elders. They must be above reproach, self-controlled, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness or violence, and marked by a consistent household life. Note that these qualifications are not primarily professional accreditations, they are character descriptions. Paul is saying something simple and radical. The health of the church depends on the maturity of its leaders. Titus's task to identify such men, and in settings where social norms often produced leaders of convenience, was a ministry of discernment and formation. Appointing elders in such contexts required both courage and pastoral finesse. It required someone who knew how to see beyond appearances, who could recognize the slow interior work of God's grace in ordinary lives. Confronting false teachers is another difficult, often unpleasant pastoral responsibility. False teaching in Crete was not only an abstract error, it popularized lifestyles and sayings that misled people and made the gospel seem hypocritical. Paul instructs Titus to rebuke false teachers sharply and to teach what promotes healthy living and good works. The strategy is not merely punitive, it is corrective. Paul shields the flock by removing sources of confusion, while offering a robust vision of gospel life. The epistle's practical sections on younger and older men and women, slaves and masters, show a pastoral sensitivity to every layer of communal life. The gospel must reach into kitchens and courtyards, into relationships and work, reshaping the whole social fabric. Embedded within this pastoral plan is a theological jewel, the idea that grace trains. This is not a paradox to be dissolved into tidy formulas. Rather, it is Paul's insistence that the doctrine of justification by grace produces a concrete ethic. Grace is not neutral about behavior. It summons transformation. Titus's work, then, is pastoral catechesis. To show a people what a life formed by grace looks like in their context, to teach them how to live faithfully in a pagan culture, and to sustain that formation through godly leadership. Beyond Crete, the scriptural trail grows thinner but remains suggestive. 2 Timothy 4:10 mentions that Paul had left Titus in Crete, and that later references suggest Titus may have served in Dalmatia as well. Patristic writers like Eusebius and others provide traditions about his later life and death. It is important to mark those details carefully. Scripture gives us certain facts. Later church tradition offers more elaborate narratives. Patristic accounts, while valuable for the history of the church's memory, are not equivalent to canonical revelation. They often reflect the desire of later communities to remember and honor faithful servants. They may report that Titus was honored in Crete, that he ministered into old age, that his grave became a place of local memory. These traditions can be edifying and informative, but they must be read with discernment, useful as historical color but not to be elevated into doctrinal anchors. What remains consistent between scripture and tradition is the sense of a life lived in service rather than spectacle. Titus, whether he finished his days in Crete, Dalmatia, or elsewhere, is remembered primarily for reliability. A man who received a difficult assignment and carried it out without fanfare. His legacy is not built around dramatic miracles or martyrdoms recorded with banner headlines. It is built around steadiness, the slow accumulation of faithful acts that, when taken together, preserved churches and enabled the gospel to flourish in new social webs. That steadiness leads to a theological synthesis. If we call Titus an apostle, in a rhetorical sense, we mean that he was truly a sent one, entrusted with authority on behalf of Paul, empowered to act in the service of the gospel, and responsible for establishing the church's health in places rife with temptation and confusion. This construction respects the New Testament's distinctions. It does not claim that Titus had the apostolic office in the same canonical sense as the 12 or Paul himself. Rather, it acknowledges that the early mission required delegated, trusted leaders who carried apostolic authority by representation. Titus's apostolic function was practical and pastoral, and it demonstrates an apostolic logic. The church is sent into the world not only through grand missionary journeys, but through the patient work of those who establish and safeguard communities. For contemporary readers and listeners, Titus's life offers several direct, measurable applications. First, consider stewardship. Today, as in the early church, credibility matters. If financial gifts and acts of charity are to witness to the gospel, they must be handled with transparency and integrity. That might mean volunteering to serve on a church finance committee with a commitment to accountability, or it could mean personally practicing a straightforward method of giving that a spouse or a friend can verify. The practical measure here is simple. For 1 week, track one financial action, a gift, a budget conversation, a donation, and then communicate openly about it with the appropriate people. Faithfulness in money handling is not glamorous, but it is gospel-bearing. Second, think about the courage to appoint and support leaders of character. Do you currently serve in a context that needs careful leadership selection? Small groups, neighborhood ministries, workplaces? Titus's insistence on character over charisma is a corrective to our tendency to elevate style over substance. Make it a practice this month to observe leadership not only by the eloquence of the speaker, but by the fruit of their household life, their patience, and their humility. Offer to mentor or vouch for someone who demonstrates these marks. Or, if you are in a position of influence, use your voice to recommend leaders who embody them. Third, embrace the discipline of doctrinal formation that leads to daily transformation. Titus shows that teaching must shape practice. Churches and communities need teaching that connects belief to behavior. If you are a parent, a small group leader, or simply someone who influences others, choose one discipling habit to develop over the next week. A short daily reflection on how grace shapes conduct. A conversation about the meaning of training in righteousness. Or an accountability arrangement with a friend. The point is to turn abstract theology into tangible habits. Fourth, cultivate the discipline of serving without applause. How many ministries fail because people seek recognition rather than fruit? Titus's model invites a reorientation. Measure success by the health of the people and institutions you serve, not by the public profile you gain. This week, find one way to serve anonymously: a quiet phone call, a discreet gift, an unseen errand, and note the difference it makes in your posture and in the life you touch. These applications converge toward a central challenge. Will you be a steward of continuity, someone who preserves the gospel's witness by faithful, often unseen labor? The temptation is to seek dramatic impact. The biblical world frequently chooses the opposite route: the slow, patient, character-driven work that guarantees survival and growth. Titus's life is an argument for that route. If this story is speaking to you, take a moment now. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us in the comments whether you knew Titus and which Titus-like action you will commit to this week. Share the memory of a faithful leader who steadied your life. Your testimony may encourage someone else to take a similar step. As we bring this narrative to a close, let us linger on one final image. A sent one standing in the doorway of a neglected house of worship, keys in hand, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he loved the family gathered there. He called elders by name, he taught the old and the young, he handled the collection with care, he rebuked what harmed the gospel, and bolstered what helped it flourish. He did not chase headlines, he built foundations. That is Titus's quiet apostolate, a ministry of trust, of steadiness, and of faithfulness that outlived notoriety. So how will you discover your journey of faith through Titus? Begin with a single concrete commitment. Choose one of the applications above: a stewardship practice, a leadership investment, a week of disciplined teaching and accountability, or a quiet act of service, and do it. Then come back and share what happened. The early church was kept alive not by celebrities, but by sent ones who kept faith with their communities. In emulating Titus, you do not seek fame, but fidelity. You become one more hand steadying the fragile work of God in the world. If this message nudged your heart, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear about faithful service, and in the comments name one Titus-like action you will practice this week. Let the quiet work begin. May God bless you. Be at peace.